Have you ever felt that the only way out is to run away? Disappear completely? Start over where nobody knows you? Staying means risking everything, but running away can be the difference between surviving and simply ceasing to exist. Because that's the fine line Emma Carson was balancing on that cold December morning. When the clock struck 3:42 and she stared at her backpack on the bedroom floor, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Sometimes, running away isn't courage, it's a death sentence. And when Emma woke up, determined to leave Willow Ridge before dawn, she didn't know that the men hunting her were already 3 steps ahead. The backpack was packed. It wasn't big. Emma had learned over the 2 weeks since that terrible night in the alley that you can't carry a whole life on your back and still expect to move fast. So she'd chosen only the essentials: 3 changes of clothes, documents hidden at the bottom, a first aid kit because old nurse habits never die, and all the money she'd managed to gather, $1,800, in spent bills that seemed simultaneously too much and too pathetic to build a new life. The money was counted and recounted obsessively, as if the numbers would magically change and suddenly become enough to actually disappear the way she needed. Emma had planned every detail of her escape with the kind of desperate meticulousness that comes when you know a single mistake could cost you your life. She had studied bus schedules for cities she'd never heard of. She had researched places where you could work without asking too many questions. She had even chosen a new name. Sarah Mitchell, and had practiced signing it until it sounded natural. She had planned every detail except one. Except the possibility that while she was planning her escape, meticulously choosing routes and times and false identities, they were also planning, watching, and that when she finally opened that door at 4 a.m, with her backpack and her desperate plans, she would find Sheriff Jake Mercer standing there with surveillance photos that would show something absolutely terrifying. They already knew. Have you ever been through this? That moment when you realize that the plan that seemed so clever, so carefully constructed, was actually exactly what your enemy expected you to do. Where your supposed intelligence was just predictability, and your courage was just ignorance about how deep the danger really was. Emma had thought she was being strategic. She had waited 2 weeks, observing patterns, trying not to seem too scared. When the anonymous calls came in, they did come. Always at 3 a.m when the fear is most acute. Always with that distorted voice saying vague but terrifying things about keeping your mouth shut and consequences. She had noticed the strange cars that appeared on her street, but had told herself it was paranoia. She had felt eyes on her back when she walked home from the hospital, but had forced herself to keep walking with her head held high because admitting the fear was letting it win. But fear had won anyway. It had grown like a malignant tumor until Emma could no longer sleep without jumping at every noise, could no longer work without constantly checking the emergency exits, could no longer live a life that seemed remotely normal. And when you can no longer live, when each day is just survival, with constant terror as your companion, running away starts to seem not only reasonable, but necessary. Stay with me until the end. Because what happened that morning when Emma grabbed her backpack and opened the door, expecting to find an empty hallway, and instead found Jake Mercer with eyes that had seen too much and a folder full of evidence that would change everything, was the moment her story stopped being about escape and started being about something completely different. Something more dangerous, more complicated, and strangely, something that for the first time in weeks made her feel that maybe she wasn't completely alone. Jake was leaning against the wall opposite her door, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his badge reflecting the dim light of the hallway lamp that flickered intermittently, as it always did at 4 a.m in that old building. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He didn't seem at all shocked that she was leaving with a backpack at 4 a.m. In fact, he seemed prepared, as if he had been expecting exactly this. Going somewhere? Jake asked, his voice low but firm, carrying that natural authority that made people stop and pay attention even when he wasn't trying to. There was no judgment in that question, no accusation. Just a direct question that demanded a direct answer. Emma felt her heart sink through her chest, through the floor, through all the floors of the building, until it reached somewhere near the center of the earth. "How did you?" she began, but the words died because she already knew the answer. Of course he knew. Jake Mercer always knew. "I know you," he said simply, and there was something in those 3 words, something about the way he said them, with that quiet but absolute certainty that made Emma realize he truly knew her. Not superficially, not just the basic facts of their affair, but he knew her. He had observed, he had paid attention, he had seen the signs she thought she had hidden so well. The way she had checked escape routes, the way she had subtly begun to say goodbye to small things, the way her eyes had that look of someone who had already mentally left, even when her body was still present. "Jake, I need to do this," Emma said, her voice weaker than she intended, carrying all the exhaustion of 2 weeks, living in constant terror. "I can't anymore. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I can't live like this. If I'm not here, maybe they'll leave me alone. Maybe I can just disappear and start over somewhere where nobody knows who I am." It was a logic born of desperation, and they both knew it. But Emma had clung to that logic like a shipwrecked person clings to wreckage because it was the only thing that made any sense in a world that had ceased to make sense that night in the alley. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he uncrossed his arms and pulled a brown folder from his coat, the kind of folder police officers use for evidence, for serious things, for truths that change everything. And when he opened that folder, right there in the dimly lit hallway of her building, with the smell of mold and old food hanging in the air, as it always did in that place, Emma saw something that made her blood run cold in a way no phone threat had ever managed. Photos. Dozens of them. All of them of her. Emma leaving the hospital after a night shift, her exhaustion visible even in the grainy photo. Emma entering the market last Tuesday, carrying those reusable bags she always used. Emma walking down the main street, head down, hands in her pockets. Emma sitting on a park bench, eating a sandwich during her lunch break 3 days ago. Emma, her whole life cataloged by invisible eyes she had never noticed. If you've ever felt like you were being watched, that invisible eyes were following your every move, share in the comments how you dealt with it. Because Emma was looking at the physical proof of her worst nightmare, she hadn't been paranoid. She had been right all along. And somehow, that was even more terrifying. "They're already after you," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of a truth he clearly hated having to deliver. "They've been for at least a week, possibly longer. Watching your movements, mapping your routine, studying your patterns." He pointed to a specific photo where, in the blurred background, Emma could clearly see the silhouette of a man watching her. This one appears in 7 different photos over 4 days. Always keeping his distance, always in an observation position. Emma felt her legs weaken. She leaned against the wall, her backpack slipping from her shoulder and falling to the floor with a dull thud that echoed down the empty hallway. All those times she'd felt eyes on her back, it hadn't been her imagination. All those times she'd seen the same car and convinced herself it was a coincidence, it hadn't been a coincidence. They were there. They'd always been there. Watching, waiting. "If you run away now," Jake continued, and there was an urgency in his voice that Emma had never heard before, a break in that ironclad control he always maintained. "You'll go straight to them. They're waiting for it, Emma. It's exactly what they want you to do. And if this part is touching you, if you're feeling the terror of realizing that the danger is much worse than you imagined, leave a like here so I know you're truly connected to this story. Because what comes next will show you that sometimes the person you least expect can be the only thing between you and the abyss." Emma looked at Jake. Really looked at the man she'd only known superficially during the 2 weeks since it all began. Who had taken her initial statement with professional efficiency. Who had said the right words about protection and investigation, but whom Emma had kind of dismissed as just another cop doing his job, without really caring. But now, looking at him standing there at 4 a.m, with a folder full of evidence he'd clearly compiled himself, with eyes that showed sleepless nights and concern that went beyond the professional, Emma realized she'd completely misjudged him. "So what do I do?" she whispered, and there was a defeat in that question that went beyond the immediate moment. It was the question of someone who had just realized there were no easy ways out, that every door she thought was open actually led to a trap. Do I stay here and wait for them to come and get me? Do I trust a system that clearly can't protect me when people have been watching me for a week and nobody noticed? Jake closed the folder and took a step forward, closing the space between them until Emma could see every detail of his face, the tense line of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes that revealed he hadn't slept properly either, and something deeper that she couldn't name, but that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You trust me," he said, and it wasn't a request but a declaration. "And you let me do my job. Way. Your way," Emma repeated, and there was almost a bitter laugh wanting to emerge, because what could a small-town sheriff do against people who clearly had enough resources and sophistication to mount a full-blown surveillance operation without being noticed? "Jake, you're a person. These men have resources, they have connections, and I have something they don't have." Jake interrupted her, and there was a fierce intensity in his eyes that made Emma stop breathing. "Personal motivation. Not to fail. And if you want to follow more stories like this, stories that delve deep into the real emotions of people facing impossible situations, subscribe to the channel. Because Emma and Jake are just beginning this journey, and you'll want to be here when the next revelations come." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that went far beyond the immediate situation. Emma searched Jake's eyes for signs of exactly what he meant by that personal motivation not to fail. Was this about her specifically, or about something deeper, some old wound he was trying to heal through her? But before she could ask, Jake was already moving, picking up her backpack from the floor and handing it back to her, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the urgency of the situation. "You have 5 minutes to decide," he said. "Because if you're going to do this, if you're really going to run away, despite everything I've just shown, why can't stop you." "But, Emma, .. double quotes," he paused. And what he said next was delivered with a brutal honesty that needed no artifice. "If you go, you probably won't survive the weekend, and I'll have to live with that." The way he phrased those last words, "I'll have to live with it," revealed more than he likely intended to reveal. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because to truly understand why Emma had reached that point, packing a backpack at 4 a.m, ready to abandon her entire life, you need to understand exactly what those 2 weeks since that night in the alley had done to her. And the hidden truth is that Emma Carson wasn't impulsive. She never was. She was the type of person who made lists, who planned ahead, who weighed pros and cons before making important decisions. But fear has an insidious way of turning careful people into desperate fugitives, of making logic sound like wisdom when it's actually just panic in disguise. 2 weeks had passed since that terrible night in the alley where Emma had made the fatal mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in those 2 weeks, she had experienced a transformation that no one should have to go through. She had learned what it meant to live with constant fear as a companion, like a shadow that never leaves even in the brightest light. And the threats didn't stop, no matter how many times she changed her route home. How many times she checked the locks. How many times she told herself that perhaps the worst was over. The anonymous calls always came at 3 a.m, as if whoever was making them knew exactly the time when fear is most acute, when defenses are lowest, when each word whispered through the electronically distorted line penetrated deepest into the psyche. "We know where you live. We know where you work. We know you're alone." Simple words, but carrying the weight of threats too specific to be bluffs. Strange cars appeared and disappeared with a regularity that couldn't be a coincidence. A black sedan on Monday, A gray SUV on Wednesday. Always with overly tinted windows, always parked in positions where they could be observed, without being obviously suspicious. Emma had begun to mentally catalog them, noting license plates when she could see them, but what would she do with that information? Take it to the police, who had already said they would do what they could, with that hesitation that revealed they couldn't do much. And worse than the phone calls and the cars was that constant feeling of being watched. Do you know that feeling? That tingling in the back of your neck that tells you eyes are on you even when you can't see anyone? Emma had tried to convince herself it was paranoia, that her brain was creating threats where none existed because it was traumatized. But now, looking at those photos Jake had shown her, she knew it hadn't been paranoia. It had been instinct. It had been her body recognizing a danger her mind didn't want to admit. She was just a 28-year-old nurse who wanted to live in peace. That's all. Emma had no grand ambitions for justice or revenge. She didn't want to be a heroine or a martyr. She wanted to wake up in the morning without immediate terror. She wanted to go to work without constantly checking who was behind her. She wanted a life that wasn't entirely defined by those horrible 5 minutes in an alley where she had seen something she shouldn't have. She had no training for this, nothing in nursing school had prepared her to be a witness against organized crime. She didn't have the financial resources to hire private security or expensive lawyers. She had no close family who could help. Her mother had died years ago, and she was an only child. She had no one but herself to depend on. Or at least, that's what she thought, until Jake Mercer showed up at her door with that briefcase, and those eyes that saw far more than she was comfortable revealing. The idea of disappearing, changing her name, dyeing her hair, taking a bus to a small town where no one knew her, and starting a completely new life as if Emma Carson had never existed, had begun as a desperate fantasy during sleepless nights. But over those 2 weeks, it had solidified into a real plan. Emma had researched how people disappeared, had read stories about informal witness protection, had learned about false identities and jobs that didn't ask many questions. It seemed not only logical, but necessary. It seemed the only way out that made any sense in a world that had ceased to make sense. If I'm not here, maybe they'll leave me alone, Emma had whispered to herself as she packed up that last night, folding t-shirts with hands that trembled slightly despite all her efforts to keep them steady. Maybe that's what I need to do to survive. Maybe if I just disappear, they'll lose interest and move on, and I can finally breathe again. It was logic born from 2 weeks without adequate sleep, 2 weeks jumping at every noise, 2 weeks living in a constant state of hypervigilance that exhausts not only the body but the very soul. Emma wasn't thinking clearly. She couldn't be, not after all that. She was just trying to survive in the only way her traumatized brain could conceive. But now, standing in that hallway with Jake Mercer holding photographic evidence that she was being actively hunted, that her planned escape was exactly what they expected her to do, Emma felt that desperate logic crumbling around her like a house of cards. I didn't know, she whispered, looking again at the photos Jake was still holding. I felt like I was being watched, but I thought I was being paranoid, that I was letting fear create monsters that didn't exist. Monsters exist, Jake said with surprising gentleness for someone who had a reputation for being tough and distant. And you weren't being paranoid. You were being perceptive. Your instincts were trying to warn you, Emma. But running away isn't the answer. Not when they've already mapped out your every move. Not when they're clearly expecting you to do exactly that. Emma closed her eyes, trying to process everything. 2 weeks of planning that escape. 2 weeks building the courage to take that terrifying step of abandoning everything she knew, and now discovering that it would have been suicide. That she would have walked straight into the arms of the very people she was trying to escape. How did you get these photos? She finally asked, opening her eyes to look directly at Jake. If they were watching me without me noticing, how did you? His? Because I was watching too, Jake admitted, and there was something in his tone that suggested this confession cost him something. Not in the same way. Not invasively. But after you gave your statement, something wouldn't let me just file it away and move on. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was experience. But I knew you were in real danger. So I started paying attention. I checked your street when I was patrolling. I noticed cars that shouldn't be there. And when I started seeing patterns, the same vehicles, the same people in observation positions, I knew. Emma processed it, the impact of that revelation slowly settling in. Jake had been watching, not to threaten her, but to protect her. He had been paying attention when she thought she was completely alone. Why? Emma asked, and the question carried layers of meaning. Why do you care so much? You're a small-town sheriff, with dozens of cases. Why devote so much time and attention to ... to me? Jake remained silent for a long moment, and Emma saw something passing across his face, an internal struggle between maintaining professional distance and admitting something more personal. Because I've lost a witness before, he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of old guilt and pain that had never truly healed. Sarah Hollis. 6 years ago. She was 22, had just graduated, her whole life ahead of her. She witnessed a murder, and I promised to protect her. I followed all the protocols, did everything through official channels, trusted the system. He paused, his jaw clenching. 3 days later, she was dead. Shot at her front door while I was in an office filling out paperwork. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Emma finally understood, wasn't just about doing his job, or about abstract justice. It was about redemption. It was about not failing again in the way that had clearly haunted him every day since then. Then no, Jake continued, looking directly into her eyes with an intensity that made Emma's heart race. I'm not going to let you run away to a likely death because it's easier than fighting. And I'm not going to let you face this alone because the system is flawed. I'm going to do it my way. And my way means keeping you alive, no matter what it costs. Comment below. Now I understand everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because that moment in the hallway when Emma realized that Jake had anticipated exactly what she would do and had been waiting there, probably for hours in the cold, was the turning point where everything changed. Not just the tactical situation regarding her security, but something far more fundamental about how Emma viewed herself, her situation, and the man standing in front of her, with eyes that saw far more than she was comfortable revealing. Emma had waited until 4 in the morning because she had meticulously calculated that this would be the time when the town of Willow Ridge slept most soundly. She had observed patterns over the past week when the neighbors finally turned off their lights, when the traffic on the streets practically disappeared, when even the chronic insomniacs finally succumbed to exhaustion. 4 in the morning was that dead spot between night and dawn, where the world seemed suspended, where movement would be less noticeable, where she could slip out of her old life unwitnessed. She had been so careful. He had picked up his backpack with silent movements he had practiced in the days before, until he could do it without making a single sound. He had left the apartment keys on the kitchen table, a symbolic gesture of finally letting go of that place that had been his home but now seemed more like a cage. He had written a short letter to the building manager, explaining that he was leaving, that he wouldn't be back, that he could keep the storage unit. He had turned off all the lights, checked one last time that he had everything he needed, and then opened the door with his heart pounding so loudly that she was sure the sound would echo throughout the entire building. And Jake Mercer was there. Not on the street where she could have escaped before he saw her. Not on the stairs where she could have tried to run past. But directly in front of her door. No more than a meter away, as if he had been waiting there for hours. And he probably had been. Emma could see in his shoulders that tension that comes from standing still for too long. She could see in his hair that it was slightly disheveled in a way Jake would never normally allow. She could see in the shadows under his eyes that he hadn't slept any more than she had. The badge reflected the dim, flickering light of the hallway lamp. The same lamp the building management had promised to fix 3 months ago, but never did. And his eyes, those dark brown eyes Emma had only briefly seen during formal depositions, but was now studying with renewed attention, were heavy with a complex mix of emotions. There was frustration there. Yes, probably frustration that she hadn't trusted him enough to ask for help instead of trying to run away. But there was something deeper too, something that seemed dangerously close to genuine concern, that went beyond professional duty. Going somewhere? Jake asked, his voice low but firm, carrying that natural authority that made people stop and pay attention. It wasn't an accusation, not exactly. It was more like a question he already knew the answer to, but he was giving her the chance to confirm, to be honest, to perhaps make a different choice than he knew she had planned. Emma felt her heart sink through her chest, through the floor, through all 4 floors of the building, until it reached some deep, dark place where hope would die. He knew. Of course he knew. How could she have been so naive as to think she could simply disappear without anyone noticing, without him noticing? How did you... she began, but the words died in her throat because she was already starting to understand. Jake wasn't just a sheriff doing routine work. He'd been paying attention. He'd been observing not only the men who threatened her, but her as well. He'd seen the signs she thought she'd hidden so carefully. "I know you," Jake said simply, and there was a truth in those 3 words that Emma couldn't deny even if she wanted to. Not knowing in the sense of knowing biographical details or superficial aspects, but truly knowing, understanding patterns, anticipating decisions, seeing through the masks everyone wears to hide vulnerabilities. Emma opened her mouth to argue, to defend her decision to run, to explain that she had no choice, but Jake gently raised a hand, asking her to wait. Then, without a word, he pulled that brown briefcase from his inner coat, the movement, briefly revealing the gun holster that Emma knew he carried but had somehow never truly registered as real until that moment. He opened the folder right there in the narrow hallway, under that irritating, flickering light, and began showing her the photos. One by one, methodically, giving Emma time to process each image before moving on to the next. Emma leaving the hospital on Tuesday. The camera clearly positioned across the street, with enough zoom to capture every detail of her exhausted expression. Emma entering the market on Thursday. Photo taken from inside a vehicle, judging by the angle and the partial reflection of the windshield visible in the corner. Emma walking down the main street on Saturday. This photo particularly disturbing, because it showed not only her, but also a man behind her, keeping a consistent distance, clearly following. These were taken over the last 7 days, Jake explained, his voice maintaining that controlled tone, but Emma could feel the tension rising at the edges. All from different angles. All by different people, if we're judging by surveillance standards. Emma, you're not being watched by one person. You're being watched by a coordinated operation. Emma felt her stomach churn. It was one thing to suspect she was being followed. It was quite another to see photographic evidence of professional and organized surveillance. To see proof that multiple people had been specifically assigned to track her. That they had the resources and coordination to maintain constant surveillance, without her actually realizing it until it was too late. "How did you get those photos?" Emma asked. Because if the men who were stalking her had taken those photos, how did Jake have them? Because I was watching too, Jake admitted, and Emma saw something cross his face, not exactly shame, but an awareness that what he was about to reveal crossed professional lines in ways that could be questionable. "When you gave your initial statement, something bothered me. The way you described the men in the alley, expensive clothes, professional movements. The transaction taking place in a location that suggested they had done this before and felt comfortable. They weren't amateur criminals." He moved on to another photo, this one showing one of the cars Emma had noticed but tried to ignore. "So I started doing extra rounds on your street. Unofficially, this was in my free time, without recording it on the department's spreadsheets. And I started noticing patterns. This car," he tapped the photo, "appeared 4 times in 5 days. always parked within sight of your building's entrance. This other one, another photo, 3 times, always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, when you normally came home from work. Emma was beginning to understand the extent of what Jake had done. He hadn't simply taken her statement and filed the case as just another witness for the prosecutor to deal with. He had taken the personal initiative to monitor her, to document the threats against her, to build a case that went beyond his official responsibilities. "Why did you do all this?" Emma asked, and the question carried more weight than the simple words suggested. "Jake, you have an entire city to take care of. Dozens of cases. Why dedicate your free time, your personal resources, to me?" Jake closed the folder and looked directly at her, and in his gaze Emma saw layers of motivation she hadn't expected. There was the guilt he'd mentioned about Sarah Hollis, that witness he'd lost 6 years ago and who clearly still haunted him. But there was something else too. Something he was struggling to keep hidden, but which seeped through the edges of his careful control. "Because when I look at you," Jake said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "I don't just see a witness or a case to be solved. I see someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time and who is now paying a price that no one should have to pay. I see someone who is trying to be brave, but who is clearly terrified. I see a ... double quotes," he paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "I see someone who deserves more than to die alone in a ditch because the system failed to protect her adequately." He finally finished, but Emma sensed that wasn't what he had begun to say. There was something more there, something unspoken that lingered between them like an almost physical presence. Emma gripped her backpack tighter, its physical weight suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the emotional weight of that moment. "What if I still want to go?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "What if I say that even knowing all this, even seeing these photos, I still think running away is my best chance?" Jake didn't blink. "So I can't stop you. Not legally. You're an adult. You're not in custody. You have the right to go wherever you want." He paused, and what he said next was delivered with a brutal honesty that needed no artifice. "But Emma, if you go, you probably won't survive the weekend. They're expecting it. They have people positioned at all the obvious exits, and when they catch you, ... double quotes." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The silence said it all. "Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because what happened in the minutes following that brutal revelation wasn't just about Emma processing tactical information or reassessing survival strategies. It was about a fundamental transformation in how she understood her own situation and, more importantly, in how she viewed the man standing in front of her with that briefcase full of evidence that changed everything." Emma snatched the folder from Jake's hands, her fingers visibly trembling now. All the false confidence she had built up for this escape, draining away like water through a sieve. She flipped through the photos one by one, and each image was like a punch to the gut, revealing an additional layer of danger she hadn't fully grasped until that moment. There was a photo of her, leaving the hospital last Tuesday, right after her afternoon shift. She remembered that day specifically, because it had been particularly difficult. They had lost a patient, a 52-year-old man who had gone in for routine surgery and had suffered unexpected complications. Emma had stayed late helping the family process the loss, and when she finally left, it was almost 9 o'clock at night, and someone had been there, in the darkness, with a camera, documenting her every step. There was a photo of her entering the market on Thursday. Emma could see the reusable bag she always carried. She could see the tired expression on her own face, captured in grainy but clear detail. This photo had been taken during the day, in public, in a place where dozens of people were passing by. And yet someone had managed to get the perfect position to capture her, without her noticing anything suspicious. There were multiple photos of her walking home via different routes. Emma had tried varying her route one day along the main street, another day along quieter residential streets, always changing in the hope that unpredictable movement would make her a harder target. But the photos proved that no matter which route she chose, there was always someone there, always a camera, always unseen eyes, tracking her every move. And then there were the photos that truly terrified her, those where you could see not only Emma, but also the observers. In one photo taken on Saturday when she had stopped at a park bench to eat a sandwich during her lunch break, there was a man in the background, deliberately out of focus, but clearly visible, sitting 3 benches behind her, apparently reading a newspaper, but with his body position all wrong, oriented towards Emma in a way that any trained person would recognize as surveillance. In another photo, taken one afternoon as Emma strolled down the main street doing the kind of mundane shopping that makes you feel normal for 5 minutes, there was a car parked across the street. The license plate was partially visible, and Emma could see that Jake had circled that part of the photo with a red pen and written a note in the margin. Vehicle registered to a shell company linked to the Castellano organization. "They're already after you," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of a truth he clearly hated having to deliver, but knew Emma needed to hear unfiltered and unvarnished. "They'd been for at least a week, possibly longer, watching your every move, mapping your routine with professional precision, waiting for the right moment to do ... whatever they planned to do." Emma felt bile rising in her throat. "The right time for what?" she whispered, though part of her didn't really want to know the answer. "To get you when you're most vulnerable," Jake replied with that brutal honesty that offered no false comfort. "Probably when you're alone, when there are no witnesses, when they can make it look like an accident or a robbery gone wrong, or ... double quotes." He hesitated, and Emma saw something pass across his face that looked like contained anger. "Or when you try to run away. When you're in transit, unprotected, with no one knowing exactly where you are." The implication weighed heavily on Emma. They weren't just watching her for intimidation. They were studying her, learning her patterns, waiting for the perfect opportunity. And she, naive, desperate Emma Hot, almost handed that opportunity to them on a silver platter by trying to escape exactly as they expected her to. "If you run away now," Jake continued, and there was an urgency in his voice that cut through the fog of terror descending on Emma, "you'll go straight to them. They're expecting it, betting on it. They have resources specifically positioned for this scenario." He pulled another sheet from the folder, not a photo this time, but what appeared to be a printed report. "This here," Jake explained, pointing to the document, his intercepted communications that my contact at the FBI obtained. Coded conversations, but the gist is clear. They have people at bus stations in the 3 nearest cities. They have someone monitoring the regional airport. They even have informants in some cheap hotels along the main highways, the kind of place where someone on the run would stop to rest. Emma stared at the document with growing horror. There were coded names, locations, even schedules suggesting surveillance shifts. It was a military operation in scale and sophistication, all focused on a single person, her. "How many people are involved in this?" Emma asked, her voice coming out more like a hoarse whisper. "At least a dozen directly involved in tracking you down," Jake replied. "Probably more behind-the-scenes people providing information, people with access to systems they shouldn't have, people willing to look the other way at the right moment." "Emma, you're not facing a few local criminals. You're facing an organization with real resources and serious motivation to silence you before you testify in any trial." Emma felt her legs weaken. She leaned against the hallway wall, her backpack finally slipping from her shoulder and falling to the floor with a dull thud. All those weeks trying to convince herself that maybe it wasn't so serious, that maybe they'd lose interest, that maybe she could just run away and start over all. Those comforting illusions evaporated under the weight of the evidence Jake had literally placed in her hands. "So what do I do?" Emma asked, and there was a defeat in that question that went far beyond the immediate situation. It was the question of someone who had just realized that there were no easy ways out, that every door that seemed open actually led to carefully placed traps. "Do I stay here and wait for them to come and get me? Do I turn myself in for witness protection and spend the rest of my life under a false name in some city where I don't know anyone? Jake, I don't know what to do anymore. The confession of complete helplessness took a toll on Emma, who had spent her entire life being the problem solver, the one who handled difficult situations, the one who found solutions even when they seemed impossible. But this was beyond anything she knew how to deal with. Jake put the briefcase back in his coat and then, in a gesture that surprised them both, he gently took Emma's shoulders, not with a restrictive force, but with a grounding firmness that said without words that she wasn't as alone as she felt at that moment. "You trust me," he said, and it wasn't a request, but a declaration, an offer, a promise, and let me do my job. My way. Not the way the system clearly has flaws, that these people are exploiting. Your way. Emma repeated, and there was almost a hysterical laugh wanting to emerge, because what could a small-town sheriff do against an organization that had the resources to mount a surveillance operation in multiple counties? "Jake, you're a person, a good man. I can see that now, but still just a person. These men have money. They have political connections, if the wiretaps are right. They have people inside the police force, and I have something they don't have." Jake interrupted, and there was a fierce intensity in his eyes that made Emma stop breathing for a second. Personal motivation not to fail, not to let another innocent person die, because the system is slow or corrupt, or simply doesn't care enough. Comment below. I believe him completely. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because those words, personal motivation not to fail, carried layers of meaning that went far beyond what Jake was willing to admit at that moment. And behind that confession lay a hidden truth that Emma was only beginning to realize, that for Jake Mercer, protecting her had ceased to be just about professional redemption, and had become something much more personal, much more complicated, and potentially much more dangerous for both of them. Emma studied his face under the irritating flickering light of the hallway, trying to understand exactly what he was offering. There was absolute determination there that was undeniable. Jake Mercer had that quality you saw in soldiers and in people who had faced terrible things and survived. A steely resolve that didn't bend under pressure. But there was something more too. Something softer at the edges of that hardness. Something in his eyes when he looked at her that made Emma's heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Personal motivation. Emma repeated his words slowly, testing them, trying to understand all the implications. "Jake, you mentioned Sarah Hollis, the witness you lost. Is this about redemption? About proving to yourself that you can do things differently this time?" Jake remained silent for a long moment, and Emma saw multiple expressions passing across his face. First that professional mask he wore so well, then something that seemed like inner conflict, and finally something that seemed like resignation, as if he had decided that honesty was the only way, even if it meant revealing more than was prudent. "It started like this," he admitted, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that Emma suspected he rarely showed to anyone. "When I first saw your case, when you gave that testimony, and I saw the real fear in your eyes, but also that determination to do the right thing, even though you were terrified. My first reaction was, it was Sarah. It was the memory of her sitting exactly where you were sitting, with that same mixture of fear and courage, and how I had failed her." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that Emma was beginning to recognize as a sign that he was dealing with intense emotions he would rather not feel. "So yes," Jake continued, "it started as redemption, as a chance to right what I did wrong last time. To not blindly trust the system, to not assume that protocols would be enough, to take personal responsibility instead of delegating and then having to live with the consequences." He paused, and what he said next was said more quietly, more intimately. "But Emma, at some point in the last 2 weeks, sometime between our first meeting and now stopped being just about Sarah." Emma felt the air leaving her lungs. "It stopped being about Sarah," she echoed, needing to hear him explain, needing to understand exactly what he was saying. It stopped being about redeeming past mistakes and started being about you, Jake said with an honesty that clearly cost him something. About Emma Carson specifically, not just as a witness or case or redemption project. About the nurse who works double shifts and still finds the energy to smile at patients. About the woman who helps elderly neighbors with shopping, even when she's clearly exhausted. About the person who could have simply looked the other way that night in the alley, but chose to do the right thing even knowing the risks. The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and exposed in a way that completely transformed the dynamics of their relationship. It was no longer just sheriff and witness. It was no longer just protector and protected. It was something more complicated, more personal, potentially more dangerous because feelings complicated tactical calculations and made objective decisions much more difficult. Jake, Emma began, unsure of what to say, but feeling she needed to say something, needed to acknowledge what he had just admitted. But he shook his head gently. "You don't need to say anything," he said. "Not now. Not in the middle of all this. I needed you to know that when I say I have personal motivation not to fail, it's not just about past guilt or professional duty. It's about the fact that the idea of something happening to you terrifies me in a way that, double quotes, he paused, searching for the right words, in a way that nothing has. Terrified me since I returned from Afghanistan." Emma felt tears burning behind her eyes. But she forced them back, because crying now would seem like weakness, and she needed to be strong. She needed to think clearly. But it was difficult to think clearly when Jake Mercer, the man who had a reputation for being distant and ruthless, was there admitting that he cared about her in a way that went far beyond the professional. "So what does that mean?" Emma finally asked. "Basically, what does doing it your way actually entail?" Jake seemed grateful for the shift to more tactical, more concrete territory. "It means I'm getting you out of here now. Not through official channels that clearly have leaks. Not with paperwork that leaves digital traces. I'm taking you to a place only I know, a property that belonged to my grandfather, isn't registered in my name, has no obvious connection to me that anyone looking could find." Emma processed that. A cabin, Jake confirmed. "Isolated. Defensible. With enough supplies for weeks, if needed. And I'll stay there with you. Personally. Not just checking in periodically, but actually staying, maintaining constant vigilance, ensuring that if anyone comes after you, they have to get past me first." "And your job?" Emma asked. "Jake, you can't just disappear out of town without raising questions. I've already taken care of that," Jake replied, and there was a note of satisfaction in his voice that suggested he'd planned this for longer than Emma realized. "I have 2 weeks of accumulated vacation time that I've never used. Officially, I'm taking time off to deal with family matters in another state. My replacement takes over, life goes on in Willow Ridge. And nobody needs to know exactly where I am or why." Emma had to admit she was smart. Smarter than her own desperate attempt to simply run away with no real plan other than get out of here and hope for the best. "And how long did we stay hidden?" Emma asked. "A week? 2? Forever?" "Enough time," Jake said, "for my contact at the FBI to build a solid enough case against Castellano and his organization that they no longer need his testimony to secure convictions. Or, alternatively, enough time to secure real federal witness protection, not this half-hearted protection that local police departments offer." It made sense. But Emma still had doubts. She was still afraid. She still had that voice in the back of her mind saying that accepting this meant putting Jake in danger, meant allowing him to risk everything for her, when she wasn't even sure she deserved that kind of sacrifice. "What if something goes wrong?" Emma asked softly. "What if they find you? What if something happens to you because of me?" Jake took a step closer, closing the distance until he was close enough for Emma to see every detail of his face, every line of determination, every shadow of worry. "So I deal with it," he said simply. Emma, I was a soldier. I've been in situations where the odds were worse than this. And besides, ... double quotes, he hesitated, then decided to complete the thought. Some risks are worth it. Some people are worth it. You are worth it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because that moment in the hallway when Jake said you're worth it with that absolute conviction that left no room for doubt was just the beginning of a series of revelations that would completely change how Emma understood the extent of the danger she faced and the commitment of the man who had decided to protect her. And what Jake showed next left no room for comforting illusions or denial. Jake pulled more documents from the folder, but this time they weren't photos, they were printed transcripts. Texts in small font that Emma had to strain her eyes to read under the ill-fitting hallway light. Not just surveillance photos, which were terrifying enough already, but also wiretaps he'd obtained through contacts in the FBI, people who were clearly violating protocols and risking their careers to help him because they trusted his judgment. Look at this, Jake said, pointing to a specific section of one of the transcripts. This is from 4 days ago. Intercepted communication between two numbers that we were able to trace back to known members of the Castellano organization. Emma read the words, and even through the coded language that attempted to obscure the true meaning, the threat was crystal clear. Coded conversations about the witness problem, as if Emma were merely an inconvenience to be eliminated, not a person with a life and dreams and people who cared about her. Mentions of windows of opportunity that would make the job seem less suspicious. Discussions about efficient cleanup that made Emma's stomach churn because she knew exactly what that meant. This one here, Jake pointed to another document, is from last night. A coordinated plan, just waiting for the right moment. They're literally waiting for you to make a predictable move, like trying to flee the city, so they can act in a way that minimizes attention and maximizes their chances of success. Emma felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. It wasn't just passive surveillance or intimidation to keep her quiet. It was an active, coordinated plan, with multiple people working together to find the perfect moment to silence her permanently. They know where you live, Jake explained, his voice possessing that patient yet urgent quality of someone trying to make another person understand something vital before it's too late. Not just the address, anyone can find that. But they know your specific apartment number. They know which window is your bedroom window. They know that the lock on the back door of the building doesn't work properly and can be forced without making a sound. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The broken lock was something she'd reported to management 3 times without result. One of those little problems you learn to live with in old, cheap buildings. But now that small vulnerability had become potentially fatal. They know where you work, Jake continued, turning to another page of evidence. They have your shift schedule. They probably got it from someone at the hospital. Maybe a cleaning or security staff member who doesn't even realize they're passing on valuable information. They know when you leave. They know which parking lot you use. They know you often walk to your car alone when you work night shifts. Each revelation was like another weight being added to Emma's shoulders, crushing her under the reality of how meticulously she had been studied. How completely her life had been mapped out by people who saw her death as just another task to be completed. They know where you walk when you're alone, which streets you prefer, where you stop for coffee, Jake said. And there was contained anger in his voice, now not directed at Emma, but at those who had targeted her. Emma, they have a complete profile of you. They know your routine better than you probably do yourself. Emma opened her mouth to argue, to say that he was exaggerating, but then she remembered the photos. She remembered how many details those images had captured, how many private moments had been documented without her knowledge. And she realized that Jake was probably underestimating, not exaggerating. If you try to run away, Jake said, and now he took both of her shoulders, gently but firmly, forcing her to look directly into his eyes, so there was no way to avoid or deny what he was about to say. And Emma really listened to this, Listen to every word. They have people at bus stations, waiting. They have people monitoring airports, even though it's unlikely you'll fly, because flights leave trails. They have informants at gas stations on major highways who have received your photo and instructions to report any sightings. He pulled out another sheet of paper, this one showing what appeared to be a map with multiple locations marked in red. These are known positions where surveillance is established. All the main exits from the county are covered. You won't even be able to leave Willow Ridge before being located. And once they report your position, ... double quotes. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Emma looked at the map, at all those red markings, encircling the city like a tightening net. She had thought she was being clever in planning her escape. She had spent days researching routes, memorizing bus schedules, choosing destinations that seemed obscure enough to offer anonymity. But she was just being predictable, doing exactly what a frightened, untrained person would do, following the script they expected her to follow. "So I'm trapped," Emma whispered, and there was devastating defeat in that question. "I can't stay because they know where I am and will eventually act. I can't run because they're expecting it. So what? Just hope they catch me and pray it's quick." "No," Jake said with a firmness that cut through Emma's spiraling thoughts. "You're not trapped, you're protected. If you accept my help, if you trust me enough to do this the right way instead of the desperate way." Emma searched his eyes for signs of false confidence or empty optimism, but all she saw was solid determination and something deeper, that personal care he had admitted to, that emotional investment that went beyond professional duty. "The right way," Emma repeated. "Which is to go to that cabin you mentioned. To disappear not by running away but by hiding. With you, with me," Jake confirmed. "Not leaving you there and hoping you're safe, but actually staying, keeping watch, being the last line of defense, if anyone manages to find the place, which they won't, because nobody but me knows it exists." Emma wanted to believe. God, she so desperately wanted to believe there was a solution, that there was a way out that didn't end with her dead in some ditch or disappearing without a trace. But years of being the realistic person, the person who dealt with brutal medical facts and honest prognoses, had made it difficult for her to accept promises that seemed too good to be true. "What if they find out?" Emma asked. "Jake, these people clearly have resources. They probably have people inside the police force, considering how they get all this information. What if someone realizes you disappeared around the same time as me, and makes the connection?" "I've thought about that," Jake replied. And there was satisfaction in his voice that suggested he had truly worked through every angle. "My story about taking time off to deal with family matters is verifiably actually have an aunt in Arizona with health problems. Anyone who checks will find real medical records supporting that. And you? Officially, nobody will know you've disappeared for a few days. Your next shift at the hospital isn't until Monday. You don't have clothes. Family who would check on you daily. Neighbors are used to not seeing you for days when you work heavy shifts." He had thought of everything, Emma realized. It wasn't an improvised plan or an impulsive reaction. It was a carefully considered strategy from someone with military experience who understood how security operations worked. And during this time in the cabin, Emma asked, "What are we doing besides hiding? What is the ultimate goal?" "The goal," Jake said, "is to give my contact at the FBI, a woman named Rebecca Torres, who is absolutely incorruptible, time to build a solid federal case against Castellano and the people who are threatening you. A case so strong that they don't need your testimony to get convictions. Or alternatively, a case strong enough that they can get real federal witness protection for you. Not this inadequate version that local police departments offer." Comment below. This plan actually makes sense. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter. Because Jake's answer about having lost a witness before and promising it would never happen again was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. And behind the scenes of that moment, In the internal conflict that Emma could clearly see playing on his face even under that ill-fitting hallway light, was a struggle between maintaining professional distance and admitting something that could irreversibly change everything between them. Jake hesitated for a moment that seemed to stretch much longer than it actually was, and Emma saw the battle unfolding behind her eyes, the part of him that wanted to maintain safe walls and appropriate distance fighting against the part that had decided, at some point during the last 2 weeks, that Emma Carson deserved complete honesty, even if that honesty left him vulnerable in ways he rarely allowed himself to be. So he made a decision that he knew went beyond his official responsibilities in every way that mattered. Not just tactically or logistically, but emotionally. He was about to cross a line he had sworn never to cross again, after Sarah, the line where witness became something more, where professional duty mixed with personal feeling in ways that made objectivity impossible and rational decisions far more complicated. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said. And there was a purpose in those words that left no room for argument. Now, this morning, before dawn breaks, and before anyone realizes you're gone. Not through official channels, which clearly have leaks. Not with paperwork and protocols that leave digital traces that people with access can track. I'm going to take you to a place only I know, a place that neither my colleagues in the department, nor my friends, nor anyone except me knows exists. He paused, and what he said next was delivered with an intensity that revealed how seriously he was taking this commitment. "And I'm going to protect you personally. Not by delegating to others, not by checking in periodically, but by actually being there 24 hours a day, until we resolve this in a way that means you can have your life back without constantly looking over your shoulder." Emma searched his eyes for signs that it was just duty speaking. Just that redemption he'd mentioned. Just a good sheriff doing what he thought was right. But she saw something more, something in the depths of those dark brown eyes that both frightened and comforted her. There was determination, yes, and there was that guilt over Sarah Hollis that clearly motivated him. But there was also something softer, more personal. Something that made her heart race and her stomach churn with nervousness that had nothing to do with criminals or death threats. "Why?" Emma asked, needing to hear him say it aloud. Needing to fully understand what he was offering and why he was willing to risk so much. "Why are you doing this? Risking your career, which clearly matters to you. Risking being accused of misconduct or witness, tampering or anything else that clever lawyers could argue. Jake, you're basically proposing to kidnap me and hide me, operate completely outside the system. This could destroy you, professionally, so why?" Jake remained silent for a long moment, and Emma saw multiple answers running through his mind as he decided how much truth to share, how much of himself to reveal. When he finally spoke, he began with the safe answer, the professional answer he knew Emma would accept without questioning it further. "Because I've lost a witness before," he said, and the pain in those words was genuine and profound. Sarah Hollis, 22 years old. Her whole life ahead of her, and she trusted me to keep her safe, and I failed. I followed protocols, trusted the system, did everything right according to the manual, and 3 days later, she was dead. Shot at her doorstep by someone who got her location through a leak we never fully uncovered. He stopped, and Emma saw the guilt he carried materialize on his face as a physical presence. I promised myself that day. At her funeral, when I had to look at her parents and see the accusation in their eyes, even when they said they didn't blame me, I promised it would never happen again. That if I was ever in a position to protect someone, I would do it the right way, even if it meant breaking rules or risking my career. It was true. Emma could see that it was the complete and devastating truth. But she could also see that it wasn't the only truth. There was something else there. Something Jake was struggling not to say, because saying it would make it real, make it complicated, make it impossible to pretend that this was just about duty and redemption. But it's not just about that, is it? Emma pressed gently. Jake, you just admitted that at some point, I stopped being just about redeeming your mistake with Sarah. That I stopped being just a witness and became something more. So what exactly am I to you? The question hung between them, raw and vulnerable, impossible to ignore. Jake could have retreated to professional distance. He could have deflected, or given a vague answer that revealed nothing real. But Emma saw the exact moment when he decided there were points beyond which even gentle lies of omission caused more harm than uncomfortable truth. You're someone I think about when I wake up, Jake admitted. And the words came out like a confession ripped out, revealing something he'd clearly tried to keep buried. Someone who makes me check on your building 3 times a night, even when I'm officially off duty. Someone whose smile, that smile you give patience when you think no one's looking, made me realize I'd spent 6 years living but not really feeling anything. Emma felt the air leaving her lungs. She hadn't expected that. Not so direct, not so honest, not so vulnerable. You scare me, Jake continued, and there was a brutal honesty in his voice that dispensed with artifice. Because for the first time since before Sarah even, I care about someone enough that the idea of losing her terrifies me. And I know that complicates everything. I know it makes it harder to maintain objectivity or make purely tactical decisions. I know any psychologist or reviewing officer would say I'm too compromised to handle her case properly. He took a step closer, and Emma could feel his warmth, could see every detail of his face under that irritating, flickering light. But Emma, that commitment, that inability to be objective about you is exactly what will keep you alive. Because someone who's just doing their job can be distracted or tired, or can make errors in judgment. But someone who cares personally, who sees you as a person, and not just as a case. Double quotes. He paused, searching for the right words. That person won't fail. Can't allow themselves to fail. There was something unspoken in that confession. Something in his eyes suggested that what he felt went beyond concern or care and ventured into territory of something deeper, more complicated, potentially more dangerous for both of them, because feelings made people irrational, made them take risks that pure logic would never accept. Emma should have been frightened by that intensity. She should have been worried that Jake was letting emotions cloud his professional judgment. But strangely, all she felt was relief. Relief at not being alone. Relief that someone cared enough to risk everything. Relief that, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who would stay when things got impossible, instead of running away when she needed him. Jake, Emma said softly, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to process that we, she stopped, unable to finish the sentence because verbalizing it would make it real, and real was terrifying when their lives were in danger. You don't have to do anything with this right now, Jake said, saving her from having to find words for feelings she didn't fully understand herself. Right now, you just have to decide if you trust me enough to come with me, to let me do this my way. And then, when you're safe, when Castellano and his men are behind bars, we can we can figure out what all this means. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because what happened in the next 2 hours, after that vulnerable confession in the hallway, wasn't just about escape logistics or security tactics. It was about Emma finally allowing herself to trust someone completely. And about Jake demonstrating through precise and careful actions that trust wouldn't be wasted. And the transformation that began in that hallway at 4 a.m. deepened as they moved through the sleeping city like ghosts, invisible and silent. Jake wasted no time. As soon as Emma nodded a small movement of her head that carried the weight of a decision that would change everything, he went into full operational mode. Not a local sheriff doing routine work, but a trained soldier executing a mission with military precision. And Emma, observing that transformation, finally understood completely that Jake Mercer was not just what he superficially appeared to be. First, Jake said, already moving purposefully, you need to change your clothes. Something dark, Nothing that reflects light. Nothing that will make you stand out if someone is watching from across the street. He glanced at the backpack Emma had packed. "What do you have in there?" Emma opened her backpack, showing the clothes she had packed: colorful t-shirts, light jeans, practical but not strategic things. Jake shook his head. "Let me see what you have in the closet that works best," he said, and Emma found herself letting him into the apartment, closing the door behind them, trusting this man who 2 weeks ago was practically a stranger and who was now literally rearranging his life to keep her alive. Over the next 2 hours, Jake orchestrated an exit that resembled choreography from a spy movie. He moved through Emma's apartment with a trained eye, identifying what she truly needed versus what she only thought she needed. Clothes were changed. Emma was now wearing dark jeans and a black sweatshirt that Jake had found at the back of her closet. Clothes that would make her a shadow rather than a visible target. "Documents," Jake said, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Birth certificate, passport, if you have one, bank cards, but we'll only use cash for the next few days. Any medications you take regularly. Cell phone charger, but the cell phone itself stays here. They might be tracking it." Emma followed the instructions, a little stunned by his efficiency, but also strangely comforted to have someone who knew exactly what to do when she clearly didn't. She gathered the documents, put away the money she had saved, picked up the charger, but hesitated when Jake told her to leave her cell phone. "But what if we need? I have a clean phone I'll give you," Jake interrupted gently. "Untraceable for you." "Emma, if they have the resources we suspect, they could be monitoring your number. Every call, every message, every time the phone pings a cell tower, revealing your location. You need to stay here." It made sense, but it still hurt to let go of that small piece of connectivity. Emma put her phone on the table, feeling as if she were cutting the last wire, connecting her to the life she knew. Jake reviewed everything Emma had gathered, made a few adjustments, and then explained the route they would take. "We'll exit through the back of the building. That door you mentioned with the broken lock, Ronick, that the same vulnerability that puts you at risk, will now help us get out unseen through the main entrance where there might be surveillance." He showed photos on his cell phone. Photos he had apparently taken the previous night during reconnaissance. "There's an alley that runs behind this building in the next 3. If we keep low and move quickly, we can get to Maple Street without passing any of the main streets where there might be cameras or observers." Emma watched him work the meticulous precision, the confidence born of real experience, the way he anticipated every variable and had contingency plans for problems she wouldn't even think to consider. There was something profoundly appealing about that skill, that ability to transform chaos into order, to find safe paths through impossible situations. And for the first time since that terrible night in the alley 2 weeks ago, Emma felt something beyond constant fear gnawing at her insides. She felt not exactly safe, because complete safety was an illusion in this situation, but enough to breathe without that tightness in her chest. Enough to believe that perhaps there was a way through this that didn't end with her dead. "One last thing," Jake said, pulling something from his jacket. It was a gun, than the one he carried in his holster, but still a real gun with real weight and real implications. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Emma shook her head, and Jake nodded as if he expected that response. "Okay, I'll teach you the basics when we get to the cabin. Not because I expect you to need it, but because knowledge is safety. You'll keep this in your backpack, and let's pray you never have to touch it. But if something happens to me, if we get separated, if, double quotes," he paused, clearly not wanting to verbalize the worst-case scenarios. "You have to have options." Emma gripped the gun with hands that trembled slightly, the cold, heavy metal of which made her hyper-aware of the reality of her situation. This wasn't theory. This wasn't abstract planning. This was real preparation for real danger that could materialize at any moment. They left the apartment at 6:17 a.m., that liminal time where night was giving way to day, but the city hadn't truly woken up yet. Jake went first, checking the hallway, gesturing for Emma to follow him. They went down the stairs instead of the elevator, too confined, too predictable, too easy to ambush, Jake had explained and exited through the back door, which creaked slightly but didn't attract attention. A pickup truck was parked 2 blocks away, different from the official vehicle Jake usually drove. Registered to my grandfather, who died 5 years ago, Jake explained as he unlocked it. I never updated the registration. Technically illegal but convenient for situations where I don't want electronic traces. Emma got into the passenger seat, and as soon as Jake started the engine and began driving through the empty streets of Willow Ridge, she felt the final reality sink in. She was really doing this. She was really leaving everything she knew behind, trusting completely in a man who, just 2 weeks ago, had been practically a stranger. On the way to the secluded cabin Jake had mentioned, as the town gave way to rural roads, and then poorly maintained dirt tracks, Emma finally broke the silence that had settled between them. What if they find out where we are? She asked, and the question carried all the fears she was trying not to verbalize. Jake, you said you have contacts in the FBI, that you're working on a bigger plan. But what if something leaks? What if someone makes the connection between you disappearing and me disappearing around the same time? Jake didn't take his eyes off the road, but Emma saw his jaw tighten slightly. They won't find out, he replied with a certainty that should have seemed arrogant but was somehow just reassuring. This place isn't on any official record. There's no deed in my name, no utility bills, no digital connection anyone looking could find. It belonged to my grandfather, who built it with his own hands in the 70s. When he died, he left it to me verbally, never formally through probate. He paused, and what he said next revealed layers of personal history that Emma suspected he rarely shared. It's personal. My grandfather used to take me there when I was a child. After my father left, it was our place, where he taught me to fish, to shoot, to be a better man than my father was. Nobody but me knows it exists. Not my colleagues, not my friends, nobody. Personal. The word hung between them, laden with meaning that went beyond mere geographical location. Jake was taking Emma to the most private place in his life, the sanctuary that held memories of someone who had clearly meant everything to him. He was opening up that part of himself, making it vulnerable, entrusting Emma with more than just his physical safety. Comment below. This is deeper than I imagined. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because what happened in those first few hours in the cabin wasn't just about establishing physical security or creating a defensive perimeter. Was about Emma and Jake finally existing in a space where there were no audiences, no official roles to play, nothing but themselves and the raw truth of what was growing between them. And in that forced isolation, surrounded by miles of forest and silence, that was both comforting and unsettling. The barriers they had both maintained began to crumble in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. The cabin was exactly as Jake had described it: lidded, defensible, but also strangely cozy in a way that purely utilitarian structures rarely are. Emma could see the personal touches everywhere as Jake guided her inside. Old photos on the wall showing an older man with a teenage Jake, both holding fish with genuine smiles. A worn armchair near the fireplace that had clearly been used for decades. Handmade wooden shelves filled with books, with spines cracked from repeated readings. This wasn't just a strategic hideout. It was a sanctuary. A place of memories and profound meaning. And Jake was sharing that with her, letting her into a part of his life that he clearly held sacred. While Jake checked the perimeter, ritual that Emma would quickly understand to be obsessive and necessary. For him, she finally had a moment to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. Just a few hours ago, she had been on the verge of making the fatal mistake of fleeing alone. Convinced it was her only option, prepared to disappear and hope for the best, even without a real plan or adequate resources. She would have walked straight into the trap they had specifically set, hoping she would do exactly that. She would have been located within hours, probably captured before the sun set again. And then, Emma didn't want to think about the and then, but the implications were clear and terrifying. But Jake had seen it. Not just seen it in the sense of noticing that she was acting strangely, but truly seen it. He had understood her patterns, anticipated her decisions, been right there at her door the moment she tried to run away because he knew her. Really knew her, in the way that takes time and attention and care that goes beyond professional obligation. He had, been careful. The word echoed in Emma's mind with all its implications. Jake Mercer, the sheriff with a reputation for being distant and ruthless, had been careful enough to monitor her when he thought she was alone. He had been careful enough to document the threats against her when the official system clearly wasn't doing enough. He had been careful enough to risk his career, his reputation, possibly even his freedom, to do it his way because the official way had failed before. When he returned to the cabin about 20 minutes later, bringing with him the scent of fresh forest air and that contained energy that always seemed to surround him, Emma was in the small kitchen, making coffee with hands that had finally stopped trembling. Her hands had trembled constantly and visibly for 2 weeks, a subtle tremor she couldn't control no matter how hard she tried. But now, in this place that seemed to exist outside the normal world, her hands were steady. "Thank you," she said softly, offering Jake a steaming mug as he took off his jacket and hung it near the door, strategically positioned where he could grab it quickly if needed. Emma noted, "For saving me from myself. For seeing what I was about to do and stopping me before I made a mistake I couldn't undo." Jake accepted the mug she offered, and when his fingers briefly brushed against hers during the transfer, Emma felt something electric pass between them, not discomfort but heightened awareness. The kind of touch that resonates beyond the physical. She saw that he felt it too, by the way his eyes met hers for a split second before he pulled back to a safer distance. "You don't need to thank me for doing what any decent person would do," Jake said. But there was something in his tone that suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words, as if he knew that what he had done went beyond basic decency and ventured into territory of something more complicated. "But you're not just any decent person," Emma observed, leaning against the small kitchen counter and studying him over the rim of her own coffee mug. "Any decent person would have taken my statement and passed it on. Maybe checked in with me once or twice. But you're risking your career, which I know you've carefully built. You're risking your safety by placing yourself directly between me and people who won't hesitate to hurt anyone in their path. You're bringing me into the most personal place in your life." Emma paused, gathering her courage. "Why, Jake? And don't give me the answer about Sarah Hollis, no matter how true it is. I want to know why you're doing all this for me." Jake remained silent, holding the mug with both hands. Emma saw the struggle on his face, that tension between maintaining protective walls and being honest, and then something gave way inside him. "Because when I look at you," he said, his words coming out slowly, "I don't just see a witness. I see someone who is in the wrong place and who is paying a price that no one should have to pay for doing the right thing." He took a step closer. "I see the nurse who works double shifts even when exhausted because she knows patients need care. I see the neighbor who helps an elderly lady with her shopping. I see the woman who smiles at strangers, even while carrying weight that would break most people." Emma felt tears burning because Jake was seeing her, really seeing her, in ways she hadn't realized he had noticed. "I see someone who deserves to live without fear," Jake continued passionately. "Someone who deserves to be able to walk home without constantly checking. Someone who deserves to have a future that isn't defined by those horrible 5 minutes." He paused. "And I will do whatever it takes to ensure that. Not because it's my job, but because you have become important to me in ways that go far beyond any professional oath." The air between them was heavy. Emma should have been scared, but all she felt was overwhelming relief, mixed with something warmer, something dangerously close to reciprocity. "Jake," she whispered. But she was interrupted by the sound of his cell phone, Not the normal ringtone, but an urgent sound that made Jake tense. He picked up the phone and something brushed against his face that made Emma's stomach churn. "It's Rebecca," he said. "She wouldn't call unless it was urgent." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because what happened in the 3 days following Rebecca's call transformed the sanctuary cabin into something far more complex, a place where Emma and Jake lived in a suspended time bubble, where every moment carried the weight of imminent danger, but also that peculiar intensity that comes when two people face something impossible together. And behind the scenes of those seemingly tranquil days, a hidden truth was forming, a revelation that would change everything. Jake answered the phone with that controlled efficiency that Emma had learned to recognize as a sign that he was entering full operational mode. "Rebecca," he said simply, putting it on speakerphone so Emma could hear a gesture of transparency that she appreciated more than he probably knew. "Jake," the woman's voice on the other end was professional, but carried an urgency that made Emma's stomach clench. "We have developments in Operation Castellano. We managed to intercept more communications. They know Emma has disappeared. They are actively searching, but so far they have no real leads on her location. Your plan to make it look like she fled the city is working. They are focusing resources on bus stations and airports, as you predicted." Emma saw relief spread across Jake's face, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "But there's a complication," she continued, her tone shifting to something more serious. "We're building a case against Cas, but he's slippery. Excellent lawyers. Layers of plausible deniability. We need something more concrete to ensure the accusations stick. I'm working on it, but it will take time. Maybe a week, maybe 2. How long do you think we can keep Emma hidden before they start looking in less obvious places?" Jake asked, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "It's hard to say," Rebecca admitted. "They have resources. Eventually they'll start making connections. For now, stay where you are. Keep a low profile. I'll update you as soon as we have something concrete." The call ended, and Jake put the phone away with a thoughtful expression. Emma could see his mind working through scenarios, calculating risks, planning contingencies. The 3 days that followed unfolded at their own pace. Jake established strict routines, perimeter checks every 2 hours, constant monitoring of communications, makeshift alert systems using equipment he had brought. Emma learned to exist in that state of constant vigilance, but not panic, finding strange comfort in Jake's obsessive competence. But amidst the security routines, something else was growing. Long conversations by the fireplace when Jake should have been sleeping but couldn't. Emma cooking simple meals with limited supplies and finding satisfaction in caring for someone who spent so much time caring for her. Moments where their eyes met for too long and neither of them looked away first. Jake taught Emma the basics of using the gun he had given her, and those training sessions were curiously intimate. Jake standing behind her, correcting her posture, his hands guiding hers, his low voice in her ear, explaining breathing and aiming. Emma found herself hyper-aware of every point where their bodies touched, of his heat seeping through his clothes, of his scent that was a mixture of simple soap and something more masculine that made her want to lean closer. Emma, for her part, tended to a cut Jake had gotten while checking the perimeter. Nothing serious, just a scratch from a sharp branch, but she insisted on cleaning it properly with the first aid kit. And while she worked, her fingers gentle but efficient, Jake remained remarkably quiet, watching her with that intensity that made her heart race. 3 days. 72 hours where Emma began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had managed to stay one step ahead, where she began to relax a little, to sleep a few hours at a time without nightmares, to imagine that, when all this was over, maybe there would be something real between her and Jake that would be worth exploring. And then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, Jake's encrypted cell phone rang again. It was Rebecca. And this time, the words she spoke made Jake's blood literally freeze in his veins. Emma saw the color draining from his face, saw his jaw clench in a way that revealed anger and fear in equal measure. "Mercer," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a weight that made Emma stop breathing. "You need to know something. There's a leak. Not just an outside informant or someone being bribed occasionally. There's someone within the police force, possibly within your department, actively passing information to the Castellano organization." Jake said nothing, only listened with that dangerous quietness that Emma had learned meant he was processing critical information. "And yesterday," Rebecca continued, "we monitored communication where someone specifically asked about rural properties, registered in their name or in the names of family members. They're starting to make connections, Jake. They don't have an exact location yet, but they're looking in the right places." Emma felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The cabin, that place that had begun to feel safe, where she had started to breathe again, was no longer the sanctuary they had thought it to be. It was only a matter of time before someone made the right connection, found the right record, realized that Jake's grandfather had owned rural property that had never been officially transferred. "How much time do you think we have?" Jake asked, his voice controlled, but Emma could feel the tension palpable. "It's hard to say," Rebecca replied. "Maybe days, maybe a week if we're lucky. But Jake, you need to consider moving. Or alternatively, prepare for the possibility of a confrontation." After the call ended, Jake stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone as if he could force it to give different answers through sheer willpower. Then he looked up to find Emma watching him, and she saw the whole truth there. They hadn't managed to stay one step ahead. They had only bought temporary time. The hunt had just become much more dangerous. Because the enemy wasn't just out there in the streets, in dark cars, and coded messages. It was inside. Someone wearing a badge like Jake, someone who had sworn to protect and serve, was actively working for people who wanted Emma dead. And now Jake would have to protect Emma not only from obvious criminals, but from someone who knew exactly how the police operated, who had access to systems and information that ordinary citizens would never have, who could be anywhere waiting for the right moment. "What do we do?" Emma asked, and there was a calmness in her voice that surprised her. Not resignation, but acceptance that the danger they had been avoiding was finally catching up with them. Jake looked at her, and something crossed his face, determination mixed with something deeper. "We're prepared," he said simply. "And if they come, we'll make sure it's not as easy as they expect." Comment below. Now it's become too real. And there was Jake, standing in the middle of that cabin that had been built by his grandfather's hands decades ago, looking at Emma with that fierce determination she had learned meant he wasn't going to give up, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. And Emma, looking back at him, felt something. Fundamental shift within her, no longer the paralyzing fear that had dominated her last few weeks, but a resolve born of finally having someone by her side who would choose to stay when most would run away. "We prepared ourselves," Jake repeated, and there was a promise in those two words that went far beyond security tactics or defensive protocols. It was a promise that he would be there, that no matter who came, street criminals or traitors wearing badges, he would be the last line of defense between Emma and anything that wanted to hurt her. Emma nodded, and for the first time since that terrible night in the alley, she didn't feel like a victim waiting for the inevitable. She felt like a fighter, like a survivor, like someone who had found a reason to fight that went beyond mere survival instinct. She had found something, someone, worth surviving for. Jake began making preparations, checking weapons, establishing better observation points, creating alternative escape routes in case the place was compromised. And Emma worked alongside him, no longer just a passive observer, but an active partner, learning, helping, contributing in any way she could. And as they worked side by side that afternoon, which slowly gave way to night, with the sun setting behind the trees and casting long shadows across the cabin, they both knew they were approaching something definitive. That days of relative peace were ending. That soon, perhaps days, perhaps hours, they would have to face the danger they had been avoiding. But, for the first time, neither of them was facing this alone. And somehow, that simple truth made even the impossible seem, perhaps, just perhaps, survivable. The war was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter its most dangerous phase. But Emma Carson and Jake Mercer, a nurse who had witnessed something she shouldn't have, and a sheriff who had risked everything to protect her, were ready. Or at least, as ready as anyone could be when the enemy was both outside and inside, when trust was a luxury they could barely afford, and when the only certainty was that they were in this together. Look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if you feel this tension, this connection between characters facing the impossible side by side, subscribing to this channel is the way to continue walking this path with me. Because Emma and Jake still have a long road ahead of them, and I want you here experiencing every moment of this story with me. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I need to know if you're as invested as I am. If you felt every word, every revelation, every moment where the danger became more real and the connection between them deepened. And if this touched you in any way, if you felt your heart race when they found out about the traitor, if you understood the weight of Jake's decision to risk everything, leave a like so I know. It's you telling me that these stories matter, that it's worth continuing to tell them. There's a video over here that continues, part 4. She senses she's being followed. The sheriff appears before the danger arrives. Click and follow along, because you won't want to miss what comes next. The story is just getting more exciting, and I want you here with me until the very end. See you soon.